Welcome to Darnell and Cody show. Today we're going to be continuing our Democratic presidential candidate series by comparing Andrew Yang and Cory Booker. The first thing I want to talk about was Cory Booker's the war on drugs and criminal justice. So both have many similar views, but they differ on some key points here. Cory Booker seems to be mostly focusing on decriminalizing marijuana as ending the war on drugs. He wants to also reduce sentences for nonviolent drug offenders, but he isn't really addressing the problem of addiction, the health issue that is at the core of the problem in regards to especially the opioids, and how to address them as they are correlated in the war against drugs. So he does get some things right, like wanting to help those affected by the war on drugs, ending racial profiling, and providing better training for law enforcement officers. But I believe that isn't going far enough. And this is where the key difference comes from between him and Yang. So Yang is the only one, really, of the Democratic candidates that's addressing the opioid crisis as it is, creating safe ingestion sites and professional help for addicts, which has shown to be successful in reducing deaths and diseases like HIV while helping addicts recover and fight their addiction as patients instead of being treated as criminals. It's time to adopt the Portugal model, and it's time to watch how other countries have already solved the drug problem, more or less, instead of doubling down on prohibition that has done nobody any good besides puffing up the coffers of the prison industrial complex and law enforcement agencies. So it's not just Booker versus Gang here. It's really about our failed archaic policies backed by churches and capital interest groups that profit from making criminals out of addicts versus policies that have been shown to help people and make everyone safer and better informed. And what's shocking about this is that progressive candidates like Sanders and Warren, don't seem to really advocate these Portugal policies that have been shown to be effective. Sanders is fond of pointing to Europe and relating their successes in many policies, but he has really failed to address the opioid crisis as Yang is doing here. What are your thoughts on this, Cody?
Yeah, I first want to just point to the fact that Yang, unlike every single candidate running, and that basically has been the history of the way our country has dealt with this issue, he doesn't want to blame the people for what has happened to them. He wants to blame the corporations for what they've done and how they've misled the American public for years and years. For instance, the company that sold OxyContin lied and said that it was non-addictive and a miracle drug that could cure any problem that anyone had, basically. And it was marketed as such until that they were caught basically lying in the fact that it was an addictive drug, and they were fined for a very minimum amount by the federal government in comparison to their actual profit rate. So Yang wants to go back and redo that lawsuit. Essentially, he wants to sue them again for essentially murdering a large portion of the American public at this point. And he wants to get away from targeting these people who have developed fentanyl and heroin addictions for their substitute to these drugs for whatever reason. In most cases, it's less expensive to go to fentanyl. And instead, he wants to target the corporation. And another thing that's really big is the way that Portugal is doing it, as Darnell was saying. They're going about this and, talking about this very openly to their high school students, and educating people has proven to actually reduce addiction rates. So they've seen far less addiction rates in their youth for these kinds of substances as they had in the older populations. So that's another thing to note, where obviously we should be following models that are working. And as Darnell said, Bernie likes to talk about Europe when it works for him, but we should talk about it when it's working for the people, and that's what's happening in Portugal, at least in this circumstance. So the next issue I want to bring up is protecting democracy and voting rights really kind of tie together here, especially for Booker's policies. So Booker wants to end Citizens United, and we talked about how Yang wants to do this as well, but Booker also wants to restore Voting the Rights Act of 1965, which had 2 sections removed, which I'll get into in just a moment. So just to recap for the Citizens United, it basically allowed third-party corporations and associations, such as the labor unions, to use electronic communications for political reasons, even allowing ads in movies with false information about political opponents to air. So the Citizens United case was named this because the corporation Citizens United was trying to release a movie about Hillary Clinton right before the election, which was blatantly fallacious in its information and essentially targeting her and throwing her under a bus in certain circumstances. And they ruled that it was under the rights of the freedom of speech under the First Amendment for these corporations to lie in such a way. So many politicians agree that this should be overturned. And the 2 sections of the Voting Rights Act, which were edited in 2013, basically, prior to this being edited, it required states as well as Washington, D.C. to get laws approved that would change any voting laws or practices in the area, be it a district or statewide. It would have to be approved by the United States General or Attorney General, or it would have to be approved by a 3-judge panel. And this was essentially put into place back in the 65 because of obviously the Black people not being able to really have equal say in representation. They were racially discriminated against for voting, polling, and basically beaten out of polling areas sometimes, and other times they were just discriminated against based on the fact that they were Black. They were told they couldn't vote. So we tried to get rid of all that with this law. And since all these 2 sections have been overturned, there has been over 900 polling places closed in America, and it has shown that it has been a decreased rate of new voters, especially among minorities. And all restrictions on voting have subsequently been, since this law has been subsequently been put into place, whereby Republicans, which is quite interesting, as Democrats aren't really trying to restrict voting rights, but for whatever reason, Republicans seem to find the need to restrict people's right to vote. And that's kind of telling of certain policies and characters of both parties there. So obviously, besides that, both candidates, Booker and Yang, want to end gerrymandering. They want to actually have an automatic voter registration, as well as making Election Day a holiday. But Yang differs quite a bit here, and I think that he protects democracy in a bit better, as well as giving certain people who don't have real representation the representation that they deserve. He wants to give DC, or he wants to make DC and Puerto Rico states, which would give them equal representation as well as full voting rights. He wants to make 18-year term limits for the Supreme Court of America. He also wants to have 12-year term limits for the congressional terms. And he wants to end filibustering laws, which have been in practice for a while and have completely slowed down pretty much all of Congress to a halt. In most cases, at least, they can vote on certain things, but filibustering just causes an absolute backlog. Yang also wants to modernize the voting process by allowing it to go through technology, such as your phone or possibly even your computer at home on government websites. And this would also allow a great deal more people to actually participate in the voting process. And he also wants to use a proportional system for the Electoral College so that when you have states with 40% of the vote going one way, that they basically will still be counted for a certain political party instead of just the entire state swinging one way or another, which makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, and in my opinion would balance out things quite a bit for our political system. So what are your thoughts there, Darnell?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, especially how Yang wants to move the voting, kind of update the voting process, with technology augmented. And how great would it be if you had like a website where you could read up on all the candidates, not just from one source, but multiple sources, and as well as votes, and have forums where you can discuss things. I mean, all these exist, but they're really scattered. And especially for like kind of like an isolated older person, you're not going to be able to be exposed to all these different sources. At least not organically. It's going to be more like, you see something more like a political ad or something. That's how you inform yourself. And, they're not going to really solve the problem of bias, but I think the progress for democracy is education. And while self-education is obviously, one of the best forms and idealized forms, something that can be provided, like government providing an election forum where there's free discussion and multiple sources being posted by different people, where they're all challenged and they're all vetted by each other, is a great way to progress democracy in the right way. The next thing I want to talk about was reproductive rights, which is something that's a big issue for both candidates. But Booker kind of takes it a next step further. He wants to actually create a White House Office of Reproductive Freedom, which to me is kind of overdoing things. So he really wants an agency that's solely responsibility is to advocate the rights to an abortion. But is more bureaucracy really what we need? And what will the department realistically be able to achieve? It seems like another big government program that will sap money with little to nothing to show for it. When states like Georgia, for instance, ban abortion, despite Roe versus Wade, they're making a statement based on democracy, based on the states' rights, based on the 10th Amendment. We might not agree with their consequences of their democracy. We don't even have to like it. But if the people of Georgia want to live in a society that reflects their values, then it's something that has to be addressed socially and culturally by Georgians, or as America, as Americans. It's not something that can really be strong-armed by the federal government. Its failure is literally self-evident in how the banning of abortion just recently passed. And the point I'm making here is that the more bureaucracy isn't the answer. And Yang also advocates obviously for upholding reproductive rights, but he isn't advocating an entire White House office to do that. There are three key things that he wants to do, which I think is kind of unique to him. Well, not necessarily unique, but it's kind of concise. He wants to give access to safe and affordable abortion and birth control services to all Americans. He wants requirements placed by individual states on access and it should be subject to oversight by a board of doctors, not the whims of legislators who have no background on the procedure or even the basics of medicine. And thirdly, he wants to provide every woman with access to contraceptives and to provide financial, emotional, and structural support to individuals who are financially struggling and become pregnant. So this is going to be solved by his universal basic income plan, which I think ultimately is that while he himself doesn't call it a silver bullet, I think it's that bullet that at least penetrates the barrier, the initial barrier that's really all-encompassing our society right now. Give universal basic income, people will start to care about the climate change. Like, okay, now I can look beyond my immediate needs of survival. Like if I'm less worried about my rent, my job, all these other things, all these pressures from monetary pressure, then I can look at, reproductive rights and say, okay, well, I can look at the well-being of my other, Americans. Healthcare, it becomes more about other people instead of just me, how I'm going to pay for my healthcare. And that's where I think that's the first step that we have to really take to get to the next step in our policies. What are your thoughts on this, Cody?
Well, I would first of all never fully back a state at just outright banning, reproductive rights or abortion rights. However, I do feel like, as you said, there obviously has to be a dialogue that takes place, and um, each side needs to be heard, and their voices needs to be basically there needs to be a compromise between the two of them, and hopefully through, as you said, Andrew's plan with UBI and guaranteeing all these different uh, birth control to people, we can avoid this kind of issue for the most part in the future. And I definitely agree that, Yang's policy covers a lot more here and isn't as extreme, I would say, where Booker goes a little bit too far with federal oversight, I would say. So, next thing I wanted to talk about was college and workforce training, which obviously Yang has a great deal amount to talk about there. But Booker, first of all, for his policies, he wants to basically have a debt-free college, get rid of, the crazy amounts of debt that people end up gaining throughout their years after college. But he wants to essentially make it so that no one ever has any debt when they go to college, which to me, I don't think is exactly feasible. And he also wants to have a tuition-free community college and vocational training. And he wants to bring back apprenticeships. And to me, I think this is all in good spirit, but just saying outright it's going to be tuition-free for every single person isn't exactly pragmatic in my view either. But he also does want to make it easier to apply for federal finance aid, which many people do need, and they are able to or would be applicable for getting, but a lot of people don't know that they actually would qualify for this or how to qualify for it, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of just fall through the radar, which is unfortunate. So it is good to make this a lot easier and more simple, which is his plan. But Andrew Yang, again, he sees this much more broadly and from different angles. So first of all, he wants to provide the UBI, as we've said, which just covers a great deal of whatever you want to do. If you want to go to community college or vocational training or normal college, your UBI after you turn 18, you're getting that, and that can go to whatever you want it to go to. But he also wants to focus a lot more on the vocational and trades than just regular college, which we're kind of overselling to kids nowadays. And we're actually kind of leading certain kids off a cliff with overselling it, where they graduate to college with nowhere to go. And again, they have that massive amount of debt, which everyone's complaining about and wants to fix. So Yang wants to get control of college prices, which is really the root of the problem, in my opinion, as well as his, where college prices have essentially increased by about 400% in the last 35 years. So he wants to get administration fees that have just jumped through the roof with people that are basically hired for bureaucracy instead of teaching kids and getting the proper education to the people for the right price. And they're all getting these government grants, of course, so he wants to, he can hold that over their heads, so he has a way to do all of this. And but he also wants to teach life skills to kids in high school, even such as time management, how to use technology in a healthy way, as he recognizes that young people are suffering an extraordinary amount of anguish from social media in particular. And then he also wants to teach how to communicate really well and critical thinking all in high school, which in my opinion would help a great deal just overall for American public. If we teach all of these things, then we can have a population that functions better and thinks um, more in depth about different issues, especially if you're teaching critical thinking to kids at a younger age than we are. Um, I feel like very few people really are taught critical thinking, and everyone kind of just teaches themselves it throughout life, and a lot of people don't arrive at it the right way, obviously. So it would be good to teach them, as you said before, Darnell. So what are your thoughts there?
I agree. It's one of those points where they of course have overlaps, but I do agree that Yang overall has the better policy than Booker does in this case. The next thing I want to talk about was the economy, and the biggest difference I saw was, like many other candidates, Booker is in favor of a minimum wage. So we'll start with that. So minimum wage, as we've talked about multiple times, it's really just not a good idea because we have wide array of different living standards, cost of living standards. So living in San Francisco is very different from living in Boulder, Colorado, or some rural area in Wyoming. So you got to take this into consideration when you're trying to mandate a federal law saying that all people need to be paid a certain amount of money for the same job, even though rent prices are drastically different, cost of goods are drastically different. It just isn't a smart idea. I'm really baffled by how people don't understand this. And who does a minimum wage really benefit? It benefits big corporations. It's going to allow corporations to squeeze out their small businesses, because small businesses can't afford often to pay minimum wage to as many employees. So what happens is that hours are cut, many employees are fired, small businesses end up going out of business, while big corporations are saying, well, look, now we can, we have a higher incentive to automate jobs away as quick as possible that can be automated away. And it's already happening, and it's only going to get worse as minimum wage is introduced, because that's where their incentives lie. And to tell each other otherwise or to anybody otherwise, it's a lie, or just people aren't lying to themselves if they think that corporations have this mindset where they want to make their workers happy. It's not. They're only solely interested in profit margins. That's how they're designed to function. That's how the system works. So what I really would advocate instead of that is Yang's plan. He's saying give people UBI, give people softer landing. Don't try to force small businesses to cope with this minimum wage fiasco and this nonsense of drastically different cost of living arrangements. Saying that, well, it doesn't matter where you live, everyone has to work for pay this minimum wage to their employees. Doesn't make sense. If you want to give people more options, more freedom, that comes from the freedom dividend, and I think that's the best way to go about it. Now, some other differences I should say that Booker has is he kind of advocates his own version of the freedom dividend, except it's the opposite of the freedom dividend in the sense that it's called baby bonds, and what that would do is give you $1,000 a month until you're the age of 18, and this is supposed to decrease the wealth gap between races and stuff like that. And I'm not necessarily against this policy. I would say that it's just drastically inferior to the freedom dividend, because the freedom dividend, is, so let's say you're 18 right now and the baby bond won't help you now, right? It's just something that's for future generations. What about the people of today that need help? What about the homeless man, that's never had a handout in his life or never had any support in his life? Now there's nothing for him. We only care about the babies. It's kind of like what I'm getting from this. So if you really want to spend federal dollars don't just invest in the babies, invest in the people that are, are here right now, that are still alive, not just future babies that are going to be born, but people right now. Because if you want to live in the positive future, you got to work on people that are alive right now, not focus on people that will be born. And another policy that he has is that he wants to pass the Worker Dividend Act, which requires corporations to share profits with not just shareholders, but with workers. And I don't understand this. What would really be different from giving workers an extra amount of dollars for their work, as opposed to give them some extra step and saying that, well, this is coming from the profits of the company. What if the company doesn't have any profits to share? Then do they get nothing? It just doesn't make any sense. It seems like you should get paid for the work that you do, and that should be enough. And it should be completely optional and a separate incentive program that's based on what the corporation feels is best, and not some federal oversight saying that you have to give all workers a portion of their dividend. What are your thoughts on this, Cody?
Yeah, first of all, I'm totally against, basically anyone working at a company owning a share of that company. And the reason for that is that this law was basically put in place, I believe, and I may be mistaken, but I believe it was put into place in 1983, where CEOs, board of executives, could start buying shares. And what this ends up doing is allowing them to hide taxes and the revenue, essentially, and pay themselves through these stocks and the shares of their company. And it just leads down a slippery slope, in my opinion. And again, when you're paying employees a share of that instead of just paying them a wage, it just doesn't seem realistic or really logical even. And there's certain companies that do give shares to their employees as well. Those are really high-end companies for the most part. So I just don't think it's reasonable. And for the UBI or the minimum wage thing, the UBI gives people an effective $6 raise for their 40-hour work week. That's every single American human, whether you're working or not, you're getting a $6 raise. So Yang does support raising the minimum wage federally, but he wouldn't go higher than maybe 12. He said 10 is a good number for that. So effectively, under his policies, minimum wage is going to be $16 an hour, and he's not going to destroy small businesses in the process. So you're literally going to end up making $1 more an hour under Yang's proposal than you are for anyone saying that they support a $15 minimum wage. So just keep that in mind. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, specifically about Cory Booker, and I'm not really sure why he has to make this such a forefront of his platform. And it was kind of a little bit tucked away under national security. But I'll just tell you guys right now, you go to his website, he has about 4 or 5 bullet points on each issue that are a sentence long. And he has maybe 12 issues that he has on his website. And then you go under national security and you click on what's the plan. And he has this massive dissertation that's like 2 pages long on white supremacy and hate crimes. And so when you're talking about white supremacy in particular for hate crimes, it just seems to me that's not realistic or pragmatic or even a reflection of what's going on in reality. He specifically focuses on how white supremacy is this massive problem in America, even to this day, and how he needs to create a White House office for the hate crimes and white supremacy violence, just bringing the federal government more and more involved in police work in communities that are trying to enforce themselves and should not have federal interference on basically saying it's a hate crime when it's not. And there should be investigations on hate crime, and there are, but he just goes so extreme with this. He has a lot more stuff. He wants to require the Departments of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI to conduct all kinds of assessments of people specifically associated with white supremacy groups. So he doesn't even realize that there's like, Antifa and different kinds of supremacy groups besides white people that think that they're the best, and just different kinds of hate crimes in general. He just specifically, it's all about white supremacy crime within our country. And it's a little bit baffling to me how this is the one page on his website that has like, 7 times more words on the page than any other uh, section or issue on his entire website. It's a little bit crazy to me. So what are your thoughts there, Darnell?
I'm a little bit conflicted in that, whenever there is an act of racism and race hatred and acts of violence spreading from racism, it's always serious and it should always be looked upon with the greatest scrutiny possible, and it should always be condemned. But we can say the same thing with murder. We don't have a department of murder, right? That just investigates murders, and all crimes are, or I would say most crimes, most violent crimes, are derived from hate for one reason or another. It just really makes no sense to try to racialize the issue. That really just makes it more divisive. And I think it's a cultural battle. It's not a federal battle. It's about people really having this dialogue of saying, well, what's race really? What role does it play? We can't ignore it. We can't say it doesn't exist. Even if it does, it's just a social construct. It plays a real role in the reality that we live in. So we have to be able to talk about that honestly. And where we see racism, we as a country should come together. It's not a bipartisan issue. We should all stand together and condemn it. But as far as looking at it from something that needs federal oversight, I think it's overdoing it, like you said.
Yeah, not that hate crimes happen, but the biggest thing to me that he just blatantly does not have in any of the stuff that I've read on this page, that it's all about white supremacy. There's nothing about, other kinds of hate crimes. And there are tons of other hate crimes against Jewish people. There's hate crimes from, whites on Asians, and from black on Asians, and blacks on white, and Asians on white people. The Antifa is essentially a hate group that's led by ideology, and you could even say that about like the alt-right white nationalist group, but really they're not motivated by race as much as like ideology. So I don't know. It's just too much for me.
Right, and that's all the topics that we have for today. We'll catch you next time.
Yeah, thanks, guys.